cutting-edge weapon systems to the region, and spending hundreds of billions to counter Chinese expansion. But is it enough? Or is America's Pacific pivot arriving too late, with too few resources, to stop Beijing from achieving regional dominance? The answer will determine whether Australia faces the next century as a secure, prosperous democracy or as a frontline state in a Chinese sphere of influence. Welcome to the Doctrine of War. Today we're asking the hard question that military planners in Canberra, Washington, and Tokyo are wrestling with right now. Can American power projection actually deter Chinese military action, or are we witnessing the inevitable decline of American primacy in the Indo-Pacific? We're going to examine the forces America is deploying, the capabilities China is building, and most critically, whether Australia can rely on American protection or whether Canberra needs to prepare for a future where Australian military capability, not American guarantees, determines whether Australia remains free. This is the most important strategic question of the 21st century, and the answer isn't what most people think. The American commitment, force posture, and strategic reality. Let's start with what America is actually doing in the Indo-Pacific and whether it represents a genuine strategic shift or merely rhetorical positioning. Numbers tell part of the story. The United States maintains approximately 375,000 military personnel in the Indo-Pacific theater, including forces in Japan, South Korea, Guam, Hawaii, and Australia. The U.S. 7th Fleet, based in Japan, is the largest forward-deployed naval force in the world with a carrier strike group, amphibious-ready groups, and over 50 ships. U.S. Air Force assets in the region include F-22 Raptors, F-35s, B-52 bombers, and aerial refueling tankers that can sustain operations across thousands of kilometers. Power modernization is impressive on paper. The U.S. Navy is prioritizing Indo-Pacific deployments for its newest Virginia-class submarines, Flight III Arleigh Burke destroyers with advanced air defense capabilities, and is working on next-generation systems including hypersonic missiles, directed energy weapons, and unmanned underwater vehicles specifically designed for the Pacific theater's unique operational challenges. The U.S. Air Force is rotating B-1B and B-2 bombers through Guam and northern Australia, demonstrating the capability to strike targets throughout the Chinese periphery. The U.S. Marine Corps has completely restructured around Pacific operations, divesting tanks and heavy armor to focus on expeditionary advanced base operations using mobile missile batteries that can operate from dispersed island locations. The strategic agreements reinforcing American presence are equally significant. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement with the Philippines gives U.S. forces access to 9 bases throughout the Philippines, placing American assets within striking distance of the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. The defense partnership with Vietnam is deepening despite historical animosity, giving America access to Cam Ranh Bay, one of the finest natural harbors in Asia. The AUKUS agreement delivers nuclear submarines to Australia while integrating defense industrial bases across 3 countries. The Quad framework, America, Japan, Australia, and India, coordinates on security challenges despite having no formal alliance structure. If you're tracking with us on this critical analysis of American deterrence in the Indo-Pacific and its implications for Australian security, hit that like button and subscribe to Doctrine of War. We're breaking down the strategic competitions that will define whether Australia thrives or struggles in the coming decades. But here's where reality gets complicated. American force levels in the Indo-Pacific haven't meaningfully increased despite 2 decades of rebalancing and pivoting rhetoric. The 7th Fleet has roughly the same number of ships today as it did in 2000, while the Chinese Navy has grown from less than 100 major surface combatants to over 370 ships. The U.S. Navy struggles to maintain 11 aircraft carriers, the number required to sustain continuous carrier presence in multiple theaters, and faces maintenance backlogs that keep ships in dry dock longer than planned. The Air Force can surge bombers to the Pacific during crises, but permanent basing is limited by host nation politics and the vulnerability of large air bases to Chinese missile strikes. The tyranny of distance fundamentally constrains American operations in ways that don't apply to China. U.S. forces deploying to the Western Pacific operate 8,000 kilometers from Hawaii and 12,000 kilometers from the continental United States. American aircraft carriers require supply ships carrying fuel, ammunition, and parts that must transit across the Pacific. American submarines operate months away from home ports, reducing the percentage of the fleet available for combat at any given time. American ground forces would take weeks to surge into theater, requiring strategic airlift and sea lift that's vulnerable to Chinese interdiction. Compare that to China operating near abroad. Chinese forces base from mainland territory with hardened shelters, dispersed logistics, and the entire industrial capacity of the world's second-largest economy supporting operations. Chinese aircraft can strike targets throughout the first island chain and return to base in hours. Chinese ships operate from multiple naval bases along the coast, allowing rapid concentration of forces. Chinese ground forces don't need to deploy across oceans, they're already there. The specific capability gaps are sobering when examined honestly. China operates more ballistic and cruise missiles than the United States and all its allies. The People's Liberation Army Rocket Force fields over 1,250 conventionally armed ballistic missiles with ranges sufficient to strike every American military installation from Japan to Guam. These aren't nuclear missiles requiring political authorization. These are conventional precision strike weapons that Chinese commanders could employ immediately in a crisis. American bases in Japan, particularly Kadena Air Base and Yokosuka Naval Base, would come under massive missile barrages within minutes of conflict initiation, potentially destroying aircraft on the ground and damaging ships in port before American forces could react. The air defense challenge is equally daunting. China fields advanced integrated air defense systems including the HQ-9 and S-400 missiles purchased from Russia. These systems can engage aircraft at ranges exceeding 200 kilometers, creating no-fly zones around Chinese territory and Chinese naval vessels. American stealth aircraft like the F-35 and B-2 can penetrate these defenses, but legacy aircraft cannot safely operate within these defended areas. The percentage of the American air fleet that consists of stealth platforms is insufficient to sustain high-intensity operations for extended periods. The anti-ship missile threat is perhaps most concerning. China operates the DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles specifically designed to target American aircraft carriers. While American carrier strike groups have extensive air defenses including Aegis destroyers and cruisers, defending against saturation attacks involving dozens or hundreds of missiles is extraordinarily difficult. The mathematical reality is that defenses must succeed 100% of the time while only a few missiles need to penetrate to mission kill or sink a carrier. This vulnerability fundamentally changes the calculus of carrier operations in contested waters near China. The submarine balance is shifting in ways that favor China and its near waters. While American submarines remain quieter and more capable than Chinese boats, China operates a much larger fleet, roughly 60 submarines including nuclear and conventional variants, compared to America's 50 attack submarines that must cover global responsibilities. In a Taiwan scenario, American submarines would be critically important for interdicting Chinese amphibious forces and engaging Chinese naval vessels. But the number of American boats that could reach the Taiwan area quickly is limited by deployment schedules and transit times. The amphibious assault capability gap is stark. If American and Allied ground forces need to retake territory seized by China, they require amphibious ships to transport troops and equipment. The U.S. Marine Corps can conduct limited raids and expeditionary operations, but mounting a major amphibious operation against defended shores requires weeks of preparation, massive logistics, and accepts casualties that American political leaders may not tolerate. China, conversely, is building the world's second-largest amphibious fleet specifically to invade Taiwan, with over 30 large amphibious ships and hundreds of civilian ferries that can be requisitioned for military use. The logistics and sustainment advantages overwhelmingly favor China in any extended conflict. American forces depend on ammunition, fuel, and parts shipped from depots in Japan, Guam, and ultimately from the United States itself. These supply lines are vulnerable to Chinese submarine attacks, missile strikes, and cyber attacks that could disrupt the logistics networks managing shipments. China operates on interior lines with massive manufacturing capacity and the ability to rapidly produce replacement missiles, munitions, and equipment domestically. In a protracted conflict, this industrial advantage becomes decisive. The political will dimension may be America's greatest vulnerability. Would the American public support thousands or tens of thousands of casualties to defend Taiwan or Philippines or even Japanese territory if it meant prolonged conflict with China? American withdrawal from Afghanistan despite minimal casualties suggests limited tolerance for sustained combat operations, especially those perceived as protecting other countries rather than direct American interests. China's authoritarian system doesn't face the same political constraints. The Chinese Communist Party can sustain heavy casualties if it believes vital interests are at stake. Australia's dilemma: betting on America or building sovereign capability. Now let's address the uncomfortable reality that Australian defense planners confront. America's Indo-Pacific posture may be insufficient to deter Chinese aggression, which means Australia must prepare for scenarios where American protection either doesn't arrive in time or doesn't arrive at all. This isn't defeatism. This is strategic realism that recognizes Australia cannot outsource its security indefinitely to a distant ally facing its own constraints. The force ratios tell a grim story when you examine them objectively. In a Taiwan contingency, the most likely flashpoint for major conflict, China could concentrate overwhelming force quickly while American reinforcements would take days or weeks to arrive in strength. The initial days or weeks of a Taiwan invasion would see Chinese forces attempting to establish air superiority, suppress Taiwanese defenses, and land troops before American carrier strike groups could reach the area. If China achieves its objectives quickly, say within 7 to 10 days, American forces arriving thereafter face the choice of accepting a fait accompli or initiating combat to reverse a completed conquest. Australian forces deployed to support a Taiwan defense would arrive alongside or shortly after American forces, meaning Australia would face the same dilemma, arriving too late to prevent Chinese success and forced to choose between accepting defeat or fighting to reverse it. The strategic question becomes whether Australia is willing to send its submarines, ships, and aircraft into combat against Chinese forces that have already achieved local air and sea superiority, inflicting casualties on Australian personnel for an objective that may no longer be achievable. The geographic vulnerability of American bases compounds these problems. Guam, the primary American hub in the Western Pacific, sits 3,000 kilometers from Taiwan. Far enough that aircraft must refuel multiple times to reach the battle space, but close enough that Chinese missiles can strike the island with relatively short flight times. If China conducts preemptive strikes against Andersen Air Force Base and Opera Harbor in the opening hours of conflict, American air and naval power based in Guam is significantly degraded before it engages Chinese forces. Reconstituting capability from Hawaii adds another 6,000 kilometers and days of transit time. The Australian distance from likely conflict zones is even more problematic. Darwin is roughly 3,000 kilometers from the Taiwan Strait. Sydney is 7,000 kilometers away. Australian F-35s operating from Darwin would require multiple aerial refuelings to conduct a single strike mission over Taiwan. Operationally possible but logistically intensive and vulnerable to Chinese air defenses. Australian naval vessels transiting from eastern Australia to the South China Sea require a week of sailing, during which Chinese intelligence tracks their movements and positions submarines and aircraft to intercept them. This geographic reality means that even if Australia commits forces immediately upon conflict outbreak, those forces arrive into a situation that's already been shaped by the initial engagements. If Chinese forces achieve early success, shooting down American and Japanese aircraft, sinking Allied naval vessels, and establishing air superiority, Australian forces deploying into this environment face degraded operational effectiveness and much higher casualty risks. The question Australian commanders must answer is whether to surge forces forward knowing they may be moving into a losing battle. The nuclear dimension creates additional constraints on American freedom of action that don't exist for conflicts against non-nuclear adversaries. China possesses roughly 500 nuclear warheads and is rapidly expanding its arsenal toward potentially 1,500 warheads by 2035. While American nuclear superiority remains overwhelming, the existence of Chinese nuclear weapons creates an escalation ladder that American leaders must navigate carefully. Would America risk nuclear escalation to defend Taiwan? Would America threaten nuclear retaliation if China uses conventional strikes against American bases in Japan? The ambiguity inherent in these questions creates opportunities for Chinese miscalculation and limits American options for responding to Chinese aggression. Australia, as a non-nuclear power protected by American extended deterrence, depends entirely on America's willingness to potentially risk nuclear war on Australia's behalf. This is the ultimate question of alliance credibility. Would America sacrifice Los Angeles to save Sydney? During the Cold War, this question was posed about whether America would sacrifice New York to save Paris, and European leaders had genuine doubts about American commitment despite NATO treaty obligations. Australia should have similar questions about whether geographic distance and limited direct American interests in Australian security would translate into actual American nuclear umbrella protection during a crisis. The economic interdependence between America and China creates another constraint on American military action that doesn't exist in hypothetical scenarios. China is America's largest trading partner with over $750 billion in bilateral trade annually. American companies have invested over $100 billion in Chinese operations. Major American corporations from Apple to Tesla depend on Chinese manufacturing and Chinese markets for substantial portions of revenue. A military conflict between America and China would crater the global economy, destroy trillions in market value, and impose economic pain on American citizens that could be politically unsustainable. This economic reality means American political leaders face intense pressure to avoid military conflict with China even when strategic interests suggest the need for military response. If China seizes islands in the South China Sea or imposes a blockade on Taiwan rather than invading, American leaders must weigh the economic costs of military action against the strategic costs of inaction. Australia faces a similar calculation with even less economic ability to absorb Chinese retaliation. The alliance burden-sharing imbalance raises questions about American willingness to bear disproportionate costs for defending allies. Australia spends roughly 2% of GDP on defense, meeting NATO's guideline but still far below the American burden. If conflict erupts, American forces would bear the majority of casualties, American ships and aircraft would absorb the most losses, and American taxpayers would fund the war effort. From an American domestic political perspective, this raises questions about why America should spend American blood and treasure to defend Allied interests when those allies haven't invested commensurately in their own defense. This is the politically uncomfortable conversation happening within American strategic circles. Voices from both left and right in American politics increasingly question whether defending the liberal international order is worth the costs when allies free ride on American security guarantees. If this sentiment grows, and polling suggests it is, Australia cannot assume perpetual American commitment to Indo-Pacific security regardless of circumstances. The Australian defense planning response to these realities must be brutally honest about what Australia can and cannot rely on from America. The baseline assumption should be that American forces would eventually engage in defense of Australia if Australian territory were directly attacked, but that timeline matters enormously. If Chinese forces landed on Australian soil, American reinforcements might arrive in days or weeks, but by then Chinese forces could have achieved objectives and created facts on the ground that are difficult to reverse. Australia cannot assume American forces prevent Chinese aggression. Australia must be capable of defeating initial Chinese attacks using solely Australian capability until American reinforcements arrive. This means Australia needs considerably more military capability than current planning reflects. The AUKUS submarines won't arrive until the 2030s, leaving a decade-long gap where Australia lacks the underwater capability to threaten Chinese naval operations. The Australian surface fleet is capable but too small to contest Chinese naval forces throughout the approaches to Australia while simultaneously defending sea lanes and supporting amphibious operations. The Royal Australian Air Force operates advanced F-35s but has insufficient numbers to sustain high-tempo operations across the vast distances of northern Australia and the Indonesian archipelago. The force structure Australia actually needs to deter Chinese aggression independently would cost far more than the current 2% of GDP defense spending. To field a genuinely independent deterrent, Australia would need double the submarine force, triple the number of surface combatants, significantly more combat aircraft, robust mobile missile forces capable of striking Chinese vessels and bases, comprehensive air defense systems, and the logistics to sustain high-intensity operations for months. This would require defense spending approaching 4% of GDP, politically difficult but strategically necessary if Australia cannot rely on timely American support. The strategic partnership diversification that Australia is pursuing through AUKUS, the Quad, and bilateral relationships with Japan, South Korea, and India reflects implicit recognition that American power alone may be insufficient. By building a network of capable partners who share interests in resisting Chinese expansion, Australia creates multiple options for coalition warfare that don't depend solely on American participation. If America hesitates or delays, Japan, Australia, and other partners might still act collectively to oppose Chinese aggression. The worst-case scenario that Australian planners must prepare for is Chinese military action that America decides not to contest militarily. Imagine China imposes a maritime quarantine around Taiwan, declares an air defense identification zone over the island, and uses Coast Guard vessels rather than military forces to enforce exclusion zones. This gray zone coercion might succeed in forcing Taiwanese capitulation without ever triggering the military thresholds that would prompt American intervention. Australia would face the choice of acting without America, potentially ineffectively and at high cost, or accepting Chinese fait accompli that fundamentally alters the regional balance of power. The stark reality is that American commitment to Indo-Pacific security is strong but not unlimited, is conditional rather than absolute, and is subject to political, economic, and military constraints that may prevent or delay American action during crises. Australia must plan for scenarios where Australian forces fight alone or alongside other regional partners without guaranteed American participation. That planning assumption drives very different force structure requirements than assuming America will always be there with overwhelming power. The answer to our title question, is the US shift to the Pacific enough to deter Chinese ambitions, is therefore complex. American posture deters some forms of Chinese aggression, particularly direct attacks on American allies that would trigger treaty obligations. But American forces are insufficient to prevent all forms of Chinese expansion, are constrained by distance and logistics, and face political pressures that might limit their employment during crises. For Australia, this means the hard truth that Australian security ultimately depends on Australian capability, not American promises. The US shift to the Pacific helps. It's necessary but not sufficient. And for Australia, the implications are clear. Build military capability that can defend Australian interests independently, cultivate coalition partnerships that provide options beyond the American alliance, and prepare for a future where the Indo-Pacific balance of power depends as much on Australian resolve as on American guarantees. Because the only guarantee in international politics is that countries must ultimately be capable of defending themselves. Everything else is hope, and hope is not a strategy. Thanks for watching Doctrine of War. If this hard-hitting analysis of American deterrence and its implications for Australian security resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Drop your thoughts in the comments on whether Australia can truly rely on American protection or needs to build more sovereign military capability. Stay sharp, stay realistic, and we'll see you in the next one.